So yeah, my name's James and I run Oslo Street Art Tours. We do guided tours of street art and graffiti in Oslo every Saturday at 2 o'clock. We basically want to give people an insight into the street art and graffiti that's in Oslo. It's a very small percentage of what's out there, but we hope it kind of sparks people's interest and encourage them to go and explore the city a bit more. Tøyen's an obvious starting place because we have a lot of large-scale murals in this area, but we actually ended along the river, and we really try and reflect the spectrum of street art. A lot of people think street art is just large-scale murals, but it's everything from small stencils and paste-ups to stickers. And along the river there's actually a really famous piece of graffiti painted in 1991, so it's almost 30 years old, and that was it's referred to as a burner. It was a really famous piece of graffiti that inspired a lot of other local artists to get involved in this culture. So we talk about that as well as these kind of more modern murals. This piece is really representative of why there are so many murals in Tøyen, because a lot of these artworks were funded as part of the Tøyen deal, and that was a compensation package that was basically paid to the local community when the city council decided to move the Munch Museum down to Bjørvika in the city centre. So obviously that was a big loss for the area, and so the compensation package was basically to help initiate other cultural attractions in the area. So this is actually, all the work in Tøyen is referred to as Tøyen Utgalleri, so Tøyen Outdoor Gallery. And obviously the Munch Museum's had a really big impact on life in Tøyen, so it made a lot of sense to reference that. So on the tour we'll talk about tiny little sculptures by a Spanish artist called Isaac Cordell. We'll talk about tags and throw-ups and making graffiti with fire extinguishers, as well as these large murals. I mean, there's a really beautiful mural, the first one painted in Tøyen in 2013 by a Chilean artist called Inti, and that's really bright, really vibrant. Looks like it was painted yesterday still, and it has a lot of symbolism, social and political kind of undertones to it. Certainly one of my favourite pieces to talk about. But to be honest, I always say you have to love all your children equally, so I try not to pick any favourites. Street art and graffiti is more accepted generally. We have female-only street art festivals, and people can paint now with permission more easily. But 25-30 years ago, when this was still quite a fledgling movement, you were really risking a lot to go out and paint the streets. You were risking getting arrested, beaten up by security guards, or maybe even getting electrocuted on the third rail if you were painting trains. And the city's dangerous enough place for women after dark as it is, without putting yourself in those positions of risk night after night. So women kind of fell away a little bit, and so a lot of the most well-known graffiti artists and street artists from the past 20-25 years tend to be male for that, and that's one of the reasons, one of the predominant reasons. It really illustrates what street art's about, and street art has like a low threshold for engagement, so anyone can experience it at any time. Sometimes you might feel a bit apprehensive about going into a museum or a gallery if you're not used to those environments, and even more so about actually giving your honest opinion if you don't like something, because someone somewhere has said this is worthy of being in this institution, so you're kind of going against perceived wisdom. When it's in the street, you take away that barrier for engagement, so people are a bit more open about expressing themselves and how they feel about the work. And a lot of the artists, on the tours, I talk a lot about the artists and why they do this, but we don't necessarily talk so much about what the work means, because the work means different things to different people. And another thing I really like about this one is how he chose the colour palette from the building, the yellow and green. There's lots of ways that you can kind of incorporate your work into the local environment, and all artists working in public space will try and work site specifically, so they'll try to take into account who's going to see the work every day, long after they've gone, and try and reflect the demographic of the area, the history of the area, these things. And you know, another simple way to incorporate the work into the environment is to choose a color palette, you know, from the buildings that already exist, as well as in content, which, you know, he did really nicely here. And it's a good place to start with the tag, because that's what he started doing 25 years ago. A lot of people say, oh, the tag's ruined it, it's such a shame that someone tagged over it. But, you know, we have to emphasize that this movement evolved from graffiti. This movement wouldn't look anything like it does today if it wasn't for the graffiti movement that came before it. So the two are like inextricably linked. So you can't have one without the other. But a really simple way of thinking about graffiti and street art is graffiti is a letter-based art form. Street art tends to be more figurative, and street art is like pop music and graffiti is like opera. You know, pop music's like easy to tap your foot to, easy to understand, easy to read, easy to interpret, and graffiti is more like a coded language, and you have to really like study it and know how to read it in order to understand it. You know, and this shift towards muralism, which is a general trend, is quite interesting because it does represent power in a way, because you have to have finance to paint something like this, and the ethos of street art and graffiti is really much more independent and much more egalitarian. So there are problems with this kind of art form because there is still a power structure involved in producing a mural, which is why I'm not necessarily that fond of it, or, you know, want to make sure that the culture doesn't shift too much in that direction, because then you replicate the same kind of power structures that exist in the fine art world. So while they can have a really positive impact and really transformative impact, they also do play into power structures a little bit. So it's important that we still encourage other people to make independent art, street art, human scale street art, you know. We were just talking about what the biggest challenge for artists is when they're making this work, and for me, I think it's remaining authentic, especially because so many people are interested in this culture now and they want to sponsor murals. If ad agencies want to sponsor murals and tourist boards want pretty murals, so you really have to stay true to your vision and why you do this and not get compromised, because then you'll just drift off. You know, it really reinforced something important to me, and that was that if we were to analyse this piece from an art historical perspective, like how technically proficient it is, its use of kind of lighting and art historical references or perspective, you would give it maybe a 2 out of 10. But if we analyse it in terms of like how it changes the look and feel of the space and people's relationship to the environment and how it makes them feel emotionally, then, you know, you could give it an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And it's kind of like they're the kind of things we're looking at when we evaluate street art, as much as like how well painted it is and how skillfully it's done. And that's one of the reasons why street art is still not accepted by the art establishment, because, you know, it doesn't ascribe to these art historical values. And for us, we say, well, you know, that's fine. You know, that's not why we do it. We do it for the people in the street, not necessarily the critics and curators.